Can you take her instead of me? The boy's desperate plea echoed across the dusty ranch, his small voice trembling with fear. The rancher's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he surveyed both children standing before him. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The late summer heat pressed down on the dusty main street of Red Bluff, a rugged Montana outpost hemmed in by endless prairies and distant peaks. The sun beat mercilessly on the wooden boardwalks where townsfolk hurried about their business, eager to escape the punishing rays. Young John Smith, not yet 14, stood trembling before the imposing figure of Robert Johnson, the most powerful and mysterious rancher in the county. Despite the oppressive temperature, a chill ran down the boy's spine as he gathered his courage. John's threadbare clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, evidence of months of hardship and hunger. His once bright eyes now carried a haunted look that belonged on someone 3 times his age. Behind him, his 9-year-old sister, Mary Smith, clung to his battered shirt, her wide eyes shining with equal measures of fear and trust. The girl's tangled blonde hair framed a face that still held traces of childish innocence, despite everything they'd endured. "Mr. Johnson, sir," John began, his voice cracking with nervousness. "We need your help." The rancher remained silent, his weathered face unreadable beneath the wide brim of his hat. Robert Johnson was a legend in these parts, a man who had built his empire from nothing, whose word was as good as law in Red Bluff. Some called him fair, others ruthless, but all agreed he wasn't a man to be trifled with. Mary's tiny fingers twisted in the fabric of her faded dress, a garment that had once been blue but was now a nondescript gray from countless washings in streams and rivers. The siblings' appearance told the story of months spent surviving alone, their parents lost to the cholera outbreak that had swept through the territory like wildfire, claiming dozens of lives and leaving countless children orphaned. The townsfolk passing by cast curious glances at the scene. 2 ragged orphans confronting the richest man in the county wasn't something you saw every day. Some slowed their pace, eager to witness whatever drama might unfold. Others hurried past, unwilling to be drawn into whatever trouble these children might represent. John swallowed hard, acutely aware that this moment might determine whether they survived or perished. The boy had exhausted every other option in Red Bluff. No one would take in 2 hungry mouths to feed, not with winter approaching and resources already stretched thin. The rancher represented their last desperate hope. Mary's tangled hair fluttered in the hot breeze as she peered up at the towering figure of Johnson, her small face a mixture of awe and terror. The siblings had heard stories about this man's ranch, a sprawling kingdom where cattle roamed by the hundreds and workers were treated fairly, if strictly. It was their only chance now. John Smith's voice cracked as he pleaded with the imposing figure before him. "Mr. Johnson, please, the Carter gang's coming for me. I saw something I shouldn't have at the bank, and they know it. But Mary, she's innocent. Take her instead of me." The desperation in his young voice hung in the dusty Montana air. Silence stretched between them like an invisible barrier. Robert Johnson regarded the siblings with piercing eyes, his weathered face remaining unreadable beneath the wide brim of his old hat. The rancher's calloused hands rested on his belt, neither welcoming nor dismissing the children's plea. Mary's tiny fingers clutched her threadbare doll, Emily, the last remnant of happier times when their parents were still alive. The fabric was worn thin from countless nights of being held close for comfort in abandoned mines and makeshift shelters. The 9-year-old pressed closer to her brother, her wide eyes darting between John and the intimidating stranger who held their fate in his hands. "They'll kill me for sure," John continued, his thin shoulders squared despite his fear. "I was just looking for work at the bank when I saw them planning something." The man with the scar on his face, he looked right at me. He knows. The boy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The townsfolk of Red Bluff moved around them, some slowing their pace to watch the exchange, others hurrying past as if the orphan's misfortune might be contagious. A shopkeeper shook his head in pity before disappearing into his store. Johnson shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking. "And what makes you think I'd take either of you?" His voice was low and graveled, like stones rolling down a dry creek bed. "Because people say you're fair," John answered quickly. "They say you judge a person by their worth, not their past." His hands trembled at his sides, but his gaze remained steady, meeting the rancher's eyes with the courage of someone who had already faced the worst life could offer. Mary's doll slipped slightly in her grasp, and she clutched it tighter, pressing the faded fabric to her chest. A tear slid down her dust-streaked cheek, catching the harsh sunlight. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing moment. In the distance, a horse whinnied, and the sound of a wagon rattling over the uneven street punctuated the tension. John's desperation mounted with every second the rancher kept his silence. His future, and more importantly, his sister's, hanging by the thinnest of threads. Mary Smith's tiny fingers dug into her brother's tattered shirt sleeve. Her eyes, wide with panic, filled with fresh tears that carved clean trails through the dust on her sun-kissed cheeks. "John, don't send me away. We promised Mama and Papa we'd stay together," she whispered, her voice breaking. The threadbare doll dangled precariously from her other hand, its faded fabric face bearing silent witness to their desperate exchange. John knelt down on the hard-packed dirt of Red Bluff's main street, bringing himself eye-level with his sister. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his young shoulders as heavily as the Montana summer heat. He swallowed hard, forcing back the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "Sometimes we have to do hard things to protect the people we love," he said gently, brushing a strand of tangled blonde hair from her forehead. His voice carried more conviction than he felt, but Mary needed his strength now more than ever. Robert Johnson watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, his weathered face shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat. The rancher's calloused hands rested on his belt, near the worn leather holster that had seen its share of trouble over the years. Around them, the few townsfolk present kept their distance, their curiosity evident, but their assistance notably absent. Johnson's eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, flickered with something unspoken, perhaps recognition, perhaps memory. For a moment, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly, before returning to their stoic arrangement. "You want me to take your sister and leave you to the wolves?" he asked, his tone as rough as gravel. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Mary's grip on her brother tightened further, her small body trembling. The locket containing their mother's picture pressed against her chest beneath her faded dress, the only physical reminder of the parents they'd lost to the merciless cholera outbreak. John stood slowly, placing himself protectively between his sister and the imposing figure of the rancher. Though not yet 14, he drew himself up to his full height, meeting Johnson's gaze with desperate determination. "She deserves a chance, sir," he said, his voice steadier now. "The Carter gang won't be looking for her. They'll be looking for me." The rancher's black horse, Shadow, snorted and stamped a hoof in the dust nearby, as if sensing the tension. Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly, studying the boy with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. "And what makes you think I'm any safer than these Carter men you're so afraid of?" Johnson asked, his voice dropping lower, the challenge clear in his words. John squared his shoulders, forcing strength into his thin frame. The weight of his decision pressed down on him harder than the Montana sun beating overhead. His threadbare shirt hung loose on his bony shoulders, but his resolve was ironclad. "Yes, sir. She deserves a chance," he said, meeting Robert Johnson's piercing gaze. "I'll figure something else out. Just keep her safe." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, betraying the fear he fought to hide. Around them, the citizens of Red Bluff had paused their daily routines to witness the exchange. Some women clutched their shawls, eyes filled with pity for the orphan siblings. Others watched with thinly veiled suspicion. Orphans meant trouble, mouths to feed, potential thieves. The town had little charity to spare for children with no family. The rancher studied John carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Shadow, his black horse, snorted impatiently nearby, pawing at the dusty ground. "The Carter gang's a serious threat," Johnson finally said, his voice low enough that only John could hear. "But what makes you so sure they know it was you?" John's breath hitched in his throat. The memory flashed vivid in his mind, standing frozen behind the general store, watching through a gap in the wooden slats as 3 men emerged from the bank. The tallest one, with a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw, had turned suddenly, as if sensing someone watching. Their eyes had met for only a heartbeat, but in that moment, John knew he'd been seen. "The man with the scar looked right at me," John whispered, swallowing hard. "It was just for a second, but he saw me. I know he did." His hands trembled slightly, and he clenched them into fists. "They killed the bank clerk, Mr. Johnson. I saw his face when they did it." Mary clutched her doll tighter, pressing her face against John's side. Though she hadn't heard his words, she sensed his fear. "And you're willing to face them alone?" Johnson asked, his dark eyes narrowing. "To save your sister?" John looked down at Mary's tangled blonde hair, remembering his promise to their parents as cholera took them both, that he would protect her no matter what. He thought of the abandoned mine where they'd been sleeping, the hunger that gnawed constantly at their bellies, the coming winter that would surely claim them both if something didn't change. "I'd do anything for her," he answered simply. "She's all I have left in this world." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the nervous stamping of Shadow, Robert Johnson's black horse. The animal seemed to mirror the tension in the air, pawing at the dusty ground with one powerful hoof. Mary Smith clutched her threadbare doll tighter to her chest, her small body trembling with each sob that escaped her lips. The doll's faded fabric absorbed her tears as she pressed her face against it, seeking comfort from the last remnant of her former life. "She's all I have left," John insisted, his voice cracking with raw emotion. His thin shoulders squared despite his exhaustion. "Don't let her pay for something she didn't do." The rancher's weathered face remained impassive as he studied the siblings. The townspeople of Red Bluff had begun to disperse, returning to their business with occasional backward glances. Some whispered among themselves, but none offered help. Orphans were common enough in these harsh territories, and most folks had troubles of their own. Finally, Johnson spoke, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "What if I told you I might be willing to take both of you?" John's head snapped up, his eyes widening with disbelief. Hope flared in his chest, immediately tempered by suspicion. Why would this powerful man, known throughout the county for his reclusiveness, suddenly offer sanctuary to 2 orphan children? "Both?" he echoed, his voice unsteady. "Even with the Carter gang coming?" Mary's sobs quieted as she lifted her tear-stained face, her small fingers still gripping the doll as if it might vanish. She looked between her brother and the imposing figure of the rancher, afraid to believe what she was hearing. Johnson's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let me worry about the Carters," he said, his tone carrying a hint of steel beneath its calmness. "My ranch is ready for trouble." The boy studied the man's face, searching for deception. The summer heat beat down upon them mercilessly, but John felt a chill run through him. Was this a trap, or their salvation? "Why would you do this?" John asked, instinctively pulling Mary closer to his side. The rancher's gaze shifted briefly to the distant mountains before returning to the children. "I have my reasons," he answered simply. "Sometimes a man needs to make things right." Mary's grip on her brother's hand tightened. She looked up at him with those trusting eyes that had kept him fighting through their darkest days. In that moment, John realized they had little choice. Winter would be coming in a few months, and they wouldn't survive another one alone. Hope flickered in John's weary eyes, but suspicion lingered in the shadows of his mind. After months of surviving alone with Mary, trusting an adult, especially one as powerful as Robert Johnson, felt dangerous. "Why help us? You don't know us," John pressed, his voice steadier than he felt. He stood protectively in front of his sister, ready to grab her hand and run if necessary. The rancher's weathered face remained impassive as he considered the boy's question. Wind rustled through the main street, carrying dust and whispers from onlookers who had gathered to witness the exchange. "I've got my reasons, boy," Johnson finally replied, his tone cryptic but not unkind. His calloused hands adjusted the reins of Shadow, the massive black horse that seemed as imposing as its master. "You and your sister come to my ranch for a month. If trouble comes, we handle it. If not, well, we'll see." John narrowed his eyes, searching for deception in the rancher's face. A month was long enough to determine if they'd be safe, but short enough to escape if things went wrong. He'd heard stories about Johnson's ranch. Hundreds of acres, dozens of workers, and a reputation for fair treatment, if strict discipline. "What would we have to do there?" John asked, his mind calculating the risks. "We can work. I'm strong for my age." Johnson nodded approvingly. "Everyone earns their keep at my place." "Your sister's young, but Mrs. Brown could use help in the kitchen. You look capable enough for the stables." Mary's small fingers clutched her doll tighter as her tears slowed. The possibility of stability after months of uncertainty made her voice tremble with fragile hope. "We can stay together?" she asked, her blue eyes wide and pleading as she looked up at the imposing rancher. Something in Johnson's expression softened almost imperceptibly when he looked at the young girl. He dismounted from Shadow with surprising grace for a man his size, kneeling to meet Mary at eye level. "That's the idea, little miss," he confirmed, his gruff voice gentler than before. "Brothers and sisters shouldn't be separated." John felt Mary's hand slip into his, squeezing with tentative excitement. He squeezed back, his mind racing. The Carter gang was real. He hadn't imagined the scarred man's threatening glare. But Johnson's ranch was miles from town, with men and guns enough to discourage trouble. "1 month," John agreed cautiously, "and we can leave if we want to?" Johnson stood, towering over them once more. "You won't be prisoners," he promised, "but I think you might find reasons to stay." John knelt beside Mary in the dusty street, his hands gently resting on her thin shoulders. He searched her face, noting how her blue eyes, so much like their mother's, were rimmed with exhaustion, yet still held that spark of resilience that had kept them alive these past months. "Do you want to go?" he asked softly, trying to mask his own uncertainty. The decision felt impossibly heavy for a boy not yet 14, but he'd been making life-or-death choices since the cholera took their parents. Mary clutched his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. The threadbare doll dangled from her other hand, its faded fabric dress nearly colorless from constant handling. "Only if you come too," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the town. "Promise me, John." Robert Johnson watched their exchange with an unreadable expression. Without comment, he turned and swung himself up onto Shadow's back with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. The black horse stamped impatiently, sensing its rider's tension. "Pack your things," Johnson instructed, adjusting his hat against the glare of the afternoon sun. "We leave in an hour. Meet me at the general store." His voice carried the weight of authority, a man accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle, his weathered face momentarily softening as he added, "Once you're on my land, You're under my protection and my rules. Understand?" The siblings nodded in unison, neither quite trusting their voices. "Good," the rancher said with finality. He clicked his tongue, and Shadow responded immediately, turning in a tight circle before trotting down the street toward the livery stable. With that, Johnson rode off to make preparations, his straight-backed silhouette growing smaller against the backdrop of Red Bluff's weathered buildings. Several townspeople who'd been watching the exchange turned away, resuming their business now that the drama appeared concluded. John and Mary remained rooted to the spot, watching until the rancher disappeared from view. The boys' mind raced with questions. Was this a trap? Could they trust this stern, mysterious man? What would happen if the Carter gang found them at the ranch? "Do you think he's nice?" Mary asked, interrupting his thoughts. John squeezed her hand. "I don't know if he's nice," he admitted, "but he seems fair. And right now, that might be enough." They turned toward the abandoned shed where they'd been sleeping, their few possessions waiting to be gathered. Between them hung a fragile, tentative feeling, caught between fear of the unknown and the first glimmer of hope they'd felt in months. Whatever awaited them at the Johnson Ranch, at least they would face it together. The siblings stood in the doorway of the cramped room they'd called home since their parents' passing. John Smith surveyed their meager possessions, carefully deciding what little they could bring to the Johnson Ranch. He folded their few clothes, 2 shirts and a pair of pants for himself, a faded dress and woolen sweater for Mary. The small knife that had belonged to their father went into the bundle next, wrapped carefully in cloth. Last came their most precious treasure, a silver locket containing their mother's portrait, the only image they had to remember her face. "Is this all we have?" Mary asked softly, clutching Emily, her threadbare doll, against her chest. "It's all we need," John replied, tying the bundle with string. Everything they owned in the world fit into a single worn sack, a fact that struck him with both sadness and a strange sense of freedom. As the sun began its descent, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the rumble of wooden wheels announced their ride's arrival. A supply wagon pulled by 2 chestnut horses rolled down the dusty street, driven by a weathered old man with a white beard and leathery skin. "That's Old Pete," a townsperson whispered behind them. "Johnson's ranch hand, been with him forever." The elderly man nodded curtly as Robert Johnson rode alongside on Shadow, his imposing black horse. The rancher dismounted in one fluid motion, despite his years, his movements betraying a lifetime of physical work. "Time to go," Johnson said simply, gesturing toward the wagon bed filled with sacks of grain, seed, and other supplies. John helped Mary climb aboard, then handed up their single bag before joining her. They nestled between burlap sacks that smelled of earth and wheat. The rough texture of the grain bags provided an unexpected comfort as they settled in for the journey. "Hold on tight," Old Pete called over his shoulder, his voice gravelly from years of harsh weather and tobacco. "Road gets bumpy past the creek." As the wagon lurched forward, John squeezed his sister's small hand. The buildings of Red Bluff began to recede, taking with them the only life they'd known. "Our new life starts now," he whispered, watching the town disappear around a bend. Mary's fingers tightened around his. "I'm scared," she admitted, her blue eyes wide with uncertainty. "Me too," John replied honestly, pulling her close as the wagon rocked beneath them. Emily the doll sat propped between them, her button eyes staring blankly ahead. The 9-year-old leaned against her brother's shoulder, taking comfort in his familiar presence. Behind them, Johnson rode silently, his watchful gaze scanning the horizon as they traveled toward the unknown, toward what might become their salvation or another disappointment in their young, difficult lives. The journey to the Johnson Ranch stretched across miles of untamed Montana wilderness. As Old Pete guided the supply wagon deeper into Robert Johnson's territory, the landscape transformed before the children's eyes. The flat, sun-scorched prairies gradually gave way to gently rolling hills covered in tall, golden grasses that swayed like ocean waves in the breeze. John Smith sat with his back against a sack of grain, taking in every detail of this new world. The boy had spent months focused solely on survival, but now found himself captivated by the raw beauty surrounding them. The wagon creaked as it climbed higher, entering dense pine forests where sunlight filtered through in dappled patterns across the trail. "Look there," old Pete called out, pointing toward a ridge where a majestic bald eagle soared on thermal currents. John nudged his sister, who had been unusually quiet since leaving Red Bluff. Mary lifted her head, her eyes widening as she spotted the magnificent bird. The tension in her small shoulders seemed to ease slightly as she watched the eagle's graceful flight. The air here felt different, crisp and sharp with the scent of pine, despite the late summer heat that still lingered in the valleys below. "It smells like Christmas," she whispered to her brother, clutching her threadbare doll closer to her chest. The wagon rounded a bend, revealing a crystal-clear stream cutting through a small meadow. A family of deer, a doe and 2 spotted fawns, drank from the water's edge, their ears twitching alertly. Mary gasped softly, pressing her face between the wooden slats of the wagon to get a better view. "It's like one of Mama's fairy tales," she whispered, her voice carrying a hint of wonder that John hadn't heard since before their parents' passing. The memory of their mother's bedtime stories, tales of enchanted forests and magical creatures, hung between them, bittersweet but somehow comforting in this wild place. Robert Johnson, riding ahead on Shadow, glanced back at the children. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes lingered on Mary's expression of awe. The rancher said nothing, turning back to scan the horizon with the vigilance of a man accustomed to finding threats before they found him. John watched the distant mountains that loomed like silent guardians against the vast blue sky. They seemed to promise both danger and shelter, much like the mysterious rancher who had unexpectedly taken them under his protection. For the first time in months, the constant knot of fear in John's stomach began to loosen, if only slightly. As the wagon continued its journey through the wild, breathtaking country, both children remained alert, but mesmerized by the untamed beauty of what might become their new home. The wagon halted in a small clearing as twilight settled over the Montana wilderness. Overhead, thousands of stars began to emerge like scattered diamonds across the darkening sky. Old Pete, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency, gathered wood and kindled a fire, while Robert Johnson secured the horses. "First decent meal of the day coming up," Pete announced, his gravelly voice carrying across the camp as he set a pot of beans to cook. The aroma soon filled the air, making John's stomach growl audibly. Mary sat close to her brother, watching the dancing flames with wide eyes. The journey had exhausted her small frame, but curiosity kept her awake. John noticed how Johnson never truly relaxed, the rancher's gaze constantly sweeping the perimeter of their camp, one hand never far from his holster. "How much farther to your place?" John finally asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for miles. Johnson turned, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "We'll reach the ranch by midday tomorrow. Built it up with my own hands over 20 years. There was unmistakable pride in his voice, though his expression remained stoic. "Started with nothing but determination and a few head of cattle." Pete nodded as he stirred the beans. "Finest spread in 3 counties now," he added, passing tin plates of beans and hardtack to the children. "Eat up. Growing bodies need strength." John ate ravenously, but noticed Mary picking at her food, still clutching her doll tightly against her chest. The girl had barely spoken since they'd left Red Bluff, overwhelmed by the sudden changes. After several minutes of hesitation, Mary inched closer to where Johnson sat. "This is Emily," she said softly, holding out the threadbare doll for his inspection. "She's been with me since I was 4. For the first time since they'd met him, the rancher's expression softened. He set aside his plate and carefully took the offered doll, examining it with surprising gentleness. "Emily's a good name," he said, his voice losing some of its gravel edge. "She looks like she's been on many adventures with you." Mary nodded earnestly. "She has. She was with me when Papa taught me to fish, and when Mama was sick. She keeps the bad dreams away." Johnson handed the doll back with careful reverence. "That's important work she's doing." A small smile bloomed on Mary's face, the first genuine one John had seen in weeks. The warmth of the moment almost made her forget their worries, if only briefly. John watched the exchange with cautious hope, wondering if perhaps they had found more than just temporary shelter with this mysterious rancher. As the fire crackled and night fully claimed the sky, Old Pete began to softly hum an old trail song, his melody blending with the distant howl of wolves and the gentle rustling of pines. The campfire crackled, sending sparks dancing toward the vast Montana sky, as Mary Smith clutched Emily to her chest. Her small voice grew stronger as she shared their journey with Robert Johnson, who sat motionless across the flames, his weathered face illuminated in golden light. "When the fever took Mama and Papa, we stayed in the cabin 3 more days," Mary explained, her eyes distant with memory. "But then the men came to take our things for the doctor bills." John watched the rancher carefully, noting how Johnson's eyes narrowed at this detail, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The boy had grown accustomed to reading adults' faces. It was a survival skill. "We found an old mine when the big storm came," Mary continued, tracing Emily's faded face with her finger. "John made us a little house inside with blankets we traded for. He caught fish with just his hands when I was too sick to walk." Old Pete stirred the beans, shaking his head in quiet amazement. John shifted uncomfortably under Johnson's scrutiny, recognizing something different in the rancher's gaze. Not pity or suspicion, but assessment. The man was measuring them, weighing their character like he might evaluate a horse or a piece of land. "John traded his boots for medicine when I got the cough," Mary added, her voice small but proud. "He carried me for 3 days with no shoes." The rancher's eyes flicked to John's worn footwear, clearly not his original pair, then back to his face. John met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away despite the intensity he found there. "You've been through more than most grown folks," Johnson observed finally, his deep voice blending with the night sounds of the wilderness around them. John's chin lifted slightly. "We take care of each other," he replied, the words coming out fierce and proud. He wouldn't apologize for their circumstances or beg for sympathy. They had survived. The rancher nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his features. "Rest up. Tomorrow's a big day." Mary curled against her brother's side, sleep claiming her almost instantly. But John remained awake long after the others had settled, staring at the brilliant stars scattered across the Montana sky. The same stars had watched over them in abandoned buildings, beneath makeshift shelters, and during endless cold nights on the road. He wondered what awaited them at the Johnson Ranch. Was this truly salvation, or just another test to endure? The rancher's scrutiny suggested the latter. John absently traced the outline of his father's knife through the fabric of his pocket, drawing comfort from its familiar shape as questions chased each other through his mind until exhaustion finally pulled him into dreamless sleep. The morning sun crested over the eastern hills, bathing the valley in golden light as the wagon approached Johnson Ranch. John Smith's jaw dropped at the sight. The property sprawled across hundreds of acres of lush Montana grassland, with cattle, more than he'd ever seen in one place, dotting the emerald pastures like dark pebbles on moss. "It's enormous," Mary whispered, her small fingers gripping the wagon's edge. A wide river cut through the western edge of the property, its surface catching the sunlight and shattering it into 1,000 glittering fragments. The main house stood proudly at the center, a 2-story structure built of solid timber and stone, weathered but imposing against the backdrop of distant mountains. Around it clustered several barns, corrals, and bunkhouses, with smoke rising from chimneys and the sounds of activity filling the air. "Welcome home," Robert Johnson said simply, a hint of pride in his otherwise stoic expression. As they pulled into the yard, ranch hands paused their morning chores, eyeing the newcomers with undisguised curiosity. Old Pete brought the wagon to a halt near the main house, where a cluster of workers had gathered. "Listen up," Johnson called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "These are John and Mary Smith. They'll be staying with us for a while." His tone left no room for questions, though John could feel the weight of unspoken ones hanging in the air. Miguel approached first, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Welcome to Johnson Ranch," the foreman said, his weathered face breaking into a brief smile. Several other workers nodded in greeting, though their expressions ranged from friendly to suspicious. "Come along," Johnson instructed, leading the siblings away from the curious onlookers. They followed him past the main house and down a short path to a smaller structure set apart from the others, a single-story cabin with a small porch and freshly swept steps. "This was my office when I first built the place," he explained, pushing open the wooden door. "Now it's yours." Inside, the space was simple but clean. 2 beds with real mattresses stood against opposite walls, each covered with a patchwork quilt. A sturdy wooden table occupied the center of the room, with 4 chairs tucked neatly around it. A small shelf held a few books, and a window let in streams of morning light. Mary's eyes widened at the sight of the beds. She approached one cautiously, as if afraid it might disappear. 2 beds, a table, and a roof that doesn't leak," Johnson said, watching their reactions. "More than most get in this world." His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "But remember, everyone earns their keep on this ranch. There's no charity here, just fair exchange." John nodded solemnly. "We understand, sir. We're not afraid of hard work." "Good," the rancher replied, "because there's plenty of it waiting." Mary ran her fingers over the patchwork quilt on her bed, tracing the intricate stitches with wonder. The small house Robert Johnson had given them felt impossibly luxurious after months of sleeping in barns and under open skies. "Is this real?" she whispered to John Smith, clutching her threadbare doll Emily close to her chest. Her eyes, still wide with disbelief, scanned the modest but clean room with its wooden floors and curtained windows. John nodded, his thin shoulders still tense with caution. "It's real for now," he replied, placing their worn sack containing the locket with their mother's picture and their father's small knife on the table. Though grateful, wariness lingered in his posture, a habit formed through months of survival. As evening settled over the Johnson Ranch, a gentle knock at their door announced Mrs. Brown. The cook entered carrying a tray laden with steaming bowls of beef stew and thick slices of freshly baked bread. The rich aroma filled the small space, making Mary's stomach growl audibly. "You children eat now," Mrs. Brown said, her weathered face softening as she set the tray down. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and flour dusted her apron. "First proper meal in too long, I suspect." Mary approached the table cautiously, drawn by both hunger and the cook's gentle demeanor. Mrs. Brown watched with satisfaction as the 9-year-old took her first hesitant spoonful, then began eating with increasing enthusiasm. "Good, see?" she asked with a smile. When Mary nodded eagerly, Mrs. Brown placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "Tomorrow, you help me in the kitchen, Nina." A girl should know how to make bread. The prospect of learning to cook, something their mother had begun teaching her before the cholera took her, lit a spark in Mary's eyes. "I'd like that," she whispered, the first genuine smile in months crossing her face. John watched this exchange silently, methodically, eating his stew while assessing this new development. The thought of Mary having something to look forward to eased some of his constant worry. After Mrs. Brown departed, The siblings washed up using the basin of water she'd left. The simple act of cleaning their faces with soap felt like unimaginable luxury. That night, as they settled into real beds with clean sheets for the first time since leaving their parents' home, John stared at the ceiling, listening to his sister's breathing grow steady with sleep. The unfamiliar comfort of the mattress beneath him felt almost wrong after so many nights on hard ground. Yet as moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting silver patterns across their new shelter, John allowed himself a cautious hope. Perhaps this mysterious rancher's offer was genuine. Perhaps this valley, with its flowing river and green pastures, could become something they'd almost forgotten existed. A home. Maybe, just maybe, this was their chance. The clang of the ranch bell pierced the dawn silence, jolting John Smith from the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He blinked at the unfamiliar comfort of a real bed before reality rushed back. Mary stirred in the adjacent bed, rubbing her eyes as heavy footsteps approached their door. Robert Johnson stood in the doorway, already dressed in work clothes, his weathered face set with purpose. "Work starts with the sun," he announced, his voice matter-of-fact. "Everyone earns their keep at Johnson Ranch." The rancher outlined their duties with brisk efficiency. John would assist Miguel with the horses and fence repair, while Mary would help Mrs. Brown in the kitchen and garden. The siblings exchanged nervous glances before nodding their agreement. After a hearty breakfast of oatmeal and fresh milk, John followed Miguel to the stables. The foreman, a stocky man with kind eyes and calloused hands, handed him a pair of worn leather gloves. "These might be big, but they'll protect your hands better than nothing," Miguel explained, demonstrating how to mend fence posts. John listened intently, determined to prove his worth. By mid-morning, John's shoulders ached and blisters formed despite the gloves. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly as he helped Miguel corral a group of yearlings into a new pasture. Sweat trickled down his back, but he refused to complain. Each post hammered, each nail driven, was another step toward security for Mary and himself. "You're a hard worker," Miguel observed during their water break. "Most boys your age would have asked for rest by now." John shrugged. "We've been through worse." He flexed his sore fingers, thinking of the months spent scrounging for food after their parents died. Meanwhile, Mary flourished in the kitchen under Mrs. Brown's gentle guidance. The cook showed her how to knead dough, her large hands guiding Mary's small ones through the rhythmic motions. "Like this?" Mary asked, her face scrunched in concentration. Mrs. Brown smiled warmly. "Exactly right, child. You've got a natural touch." Later, they moved to the garden, where Mary learned to identify ripe vegetables and pull weeds. Her small fingers proved nimble at harvesting delicate herbs, earning praise from the older woman. "My mama used to grow mint," Mary shared quietly, the first voluntary mention of her parents since arriving. Mrs. Brown nodded understandingly. "Then she taught you well." By sunset, both siblings were exhausted but satisfied. John's muscles burned from honest work, while flour dusted Mary's cheeks. They'd survived their first day at Johnson Ranch, not by begging or hiding, but by contributing. As they washed up for dinner, John caught his sister's eye and saw something he hadn't seen in months: pride. John pushed through the heavy wooden door of the main house, the aroma of freshly baked bread guiding him to the kitchen. There, he found Mary Smith standing proudly beside Mrs. Brown, her small hands dusted with flour and a misshaped loaf displayed on the counter before her. "I made it myself," Mary exclaimed, her eyes bright with accomplishment. Mrs. Brown only helped a little with the oven. The ranch cook nodded approvingly, her weathered hands resting on the girl's shoulders. "Your sister has a natural talent," she told John. "Learned faster than most of the grown hands I've tried to teach." John felt a warmth spread through his chest as Mrs. Brown ladled thick vegetable soup into wooden bowls and poured fresh milk from a ceramic pitcher. The three sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows and catching dust motes in golden beams. Try some, Mary urged, tearing off a chunk of her creation and offering it to her brother. The bread was dense and slightly undercooked in the middle, but John declared it the best he'd ever tasted. Mary's resulting laughter, genuine and unguarded, struck him like a physical force. It had been months since he'd heard that sound, not since before their parents had fallen ill. As they ate, John noticed something that set him on edge. Mrs. Brown and Miguel, who had stepped in for a quick meal, exchanged glances several times across the room. The foreman would look at the siblings, then meet the cook's eyes with a subtle nod or raised eyebrow. They were being evaluated, John realized. But for what purpose? "You've got afternoon chores waiting," Miguel announced as they finished eating. "Robert wants the new stallion worked with before sundown." John followed the foreman to the corral, where a magnificent black horse paced nervously, tossing its head and snorting at anyone who approached. "That's Storm," Miguel explained. "3 men have tried to break him. One ended up with broken ribs." He handed John a rope. "Just get him used to human presence. Don't try mounting him." John approached the fence slowly. The horse's eyes were wild with fear, not aggression. Rather than entering the corral immediately, John simply sat on the lowest rail, speaking in low, even tones about nothing in particular. The weather, the mountains in the distance, stories his father had told him. After nearly an hour, Storm's pacing slowed. The stallion approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as he caught John's scent. John remained perfectly still, continuing his one-sided conversation. Miguel watched from a distance, clearly surprised, when Storm eventually extended his muzzle toward John's outstretched hand. "Patience works better than force," John said quietly, not taking his eyes off the horse. "My pa taught me that." Miguel stood at the corral fence, his weathered hands gripping the wood as he watched John Smith approach the wild stallion. Storm, a magnificent dappled gray with eyes like fire, had bucked off 3 experienced ranch hands just yesterday. Yet here was this skinny orphan boy, speaking in low, gentle tones that seemed to calm the beast. "Easy now," John whispered, extending his hand palm up toward the horse's velvet nose. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The ranch hands gathered around, exchanging skeptical glances that turned to amazement as Storm's aggressive snorting gradually subsided. The stallion's ears, previously pinned back in fear and anger, slowly relaxed forward. "Madre de Dios," Miguel muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. The foreman had worked with horses for 25 years and rarely seen such a natural connection. When Storm finally lowered his massive head and allowed John to stroke his neck, a murmur of appreciation rippled through the onlookers. "You have a gift, John," Miguel said, respect evident in his voice. "Horses trust you. Something in your spirit speaks to them." John blushed at the praise, ducking his head. "My father used to say animals can smell fear, and kindness too," he explained, continuing to stroke Storm's muscular neck. "I just try to be honest with them." As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the pastures, Robert Johnson observed the scene from the doorway of the main barn. His face remained impassive, but his eyes followed the boy with unmistakable interest. Later, the ranch hands dispersed for supper. Johnson approached John. "Walk with me," he said, not a request, but a command. They climbed in silence up a gentle slope east of the main house. Reaching a grassy rise that overlooked the entire ranch, the valley stretched out below them, horses grazing in the near pasture, cattle dotting the distant fields, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, where Mary was likely helping Mrs. Brown prepare the evening meal. The rancher stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying his domain. "I hear you worked wonders with Storm," he began, his deep voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Miguel says you've got a way with horses he's rarely seen." John nodded, unsure how to respond to the unexpected praise. Johnson turned to face him directly, his piercing gaze studying the boy's face. "Tell me something, son," If it came down to your life or Mary's, which would you save? The question hung in the air between them, unexpected and deadly serious. John didn't hesitate for even a heartbeat. Mary, always, he answered, his voice firm despite his youth. Johnson's expression remained unreadable as the setting sun cast his weathered face in golden light. Robert Johnson studied John in the fading light, his weathered face softening as the sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The rancher's usual stern demeanor had given way to something more contemplative, almost gentle. "What if I told you there was never any Carter gang coming for you?" he asked quietly. John's world tilted on its axis. His mouth went dry as confusion washed over him. "But I saw them at the bank," he stammered, memories of that terrifying day flooding back. The scarred face, the knowing look that had sent him and Mary running for their lives? Johnson shook his head slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "There was a robbery, that's true enough, but the gang is in jail, boy. Has been for weeks now." The rancher shifted his weight, leaning against the fence post. "I needed to see what kind of brother you are. Whether you'd sacrifice yourself for Mary or use her as an excuse." The words hit John like a physical blow. He took a step back, emotions battling within him. Anger at being deceived, relief that they weren't in danger, confusion about why this man would go to such lengths. So all of this was a test? His voice cracked, betraying the turmoil inside. "Yes," the rancher admitted without apology. "And you passed it the moment you stood on that street and offered yourself up to protect your sister." John clenched his fists, trying to process everything. "You let us believe we were in danger. You watched Mary cry herself to sleep for nights." Robert nodded, accepting the accusation. "I did, and I'd do it again." He looked out over his vast property, where cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. "This world doesn't give second chances often, John. I needed to know who you really are when everything's on the line." The boy's mind raced through the past weeks, the back-breaking work, the blisters on his hands, the way Mary had slowly begun to smile again in the kitchen with Mrs. Brown, how Miguel had taught him to gentle storm when no one else could. "Why?" John finally asked, his voice steadier now. "Why go through all this trouble for two orphans?" The rancher's eyes, usually as hard as the Montana winters, held something John had never seen before: vulnerability. "Because I've been watching you both since your parents passed," Robert admitted. "I saw how you protected her, how you never gave up." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "And because I know what it means to be alone in this world." "Yes," Johnson said quietly, his weathered face softening in the golden light of sunset. "You and Mary were in real danger, of starving, of freezing come winter. I needed to know if you had the heart to survive and the loyalty to protect each other." The rancher gestured toward the sprawling ranch below them, cattle dotting the distant pastures like scattered pebbles. "I've built all this myself over 20 years, but with no family to leave it to, I was searching for someone worthy." John stood speechless, his mind racing to process this revelation. The threat that had haunted him for weeks, the Carter gang, the danger, the desperate plea had been a carefully constructed test. He felt a confusing mixture of relief and betrayal wash over him. "So there was never any danger from bank robbers?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert shook his head. "The robbery happened, but those men were caught 2 counties over. You were never their target." He placed a calloused hand on John's shoulder. "But your willingness to sacrifice yourself for Mary, that told me everything I needed to know about your character." The boy looked across the valley to where Mary was helping Mrs. Brown hang laundry, her laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. For the first time in months, his sister looked truly happy, unburdened by fear or hunger. "You want us to stay, as your family?" John asked, the words feeling strange on his tongue. The concept of family had become almost foreign after months of desperate survival. Johnson nodded, emotion thickening his voice. "If you want it, I'd like to adopt you both legally. Teach you everything I know about ranching, horses, this land." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with displaying such sentiment. "This place needs young blood, new generations, but the choice is yours." John studied the rancher's face, searching for deception, but finding only genuine hope. The man who had seemed so intimidating in Red Bluff now looked almost vulnerable, awaiting judgment from a 13-year-old boy. "Why us?" John asked. "There must be plenty of orphans looking for homes." The rancher gazed out over his property. "I've been watching you both since you arrived in town 3 months ago. Saw how you protected Mary, how you never begged but worked odd jobs, how you shared every scrap of food. That's the kind of spirit this ranch was built on." He paused. "That's the kind of spirit I want in my family." John felt tears threatening to spill. Family, home, security, everything they'd lost and desperately needed. "I need to talk to Mary first," he managed to say. "She deserves a say in our future." John Smith stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and golds. The weight of Robert Johnson's offer pressed on his shoulders. A real home, a legal family, a future beyond mere survival. For a boy who'd spent months protecting his sister from starvation and danger, such generosity seemed almost impossible to trust. "Take your time," Robert had said, his weathered face softening. "This isn't a decision to rush." The rancher's eyes, usually sharp as flint, had shown a vulnerability John hadn't seen before. Family means choosing each other, not being forced. John weighed all they had endured: the cholera outbreak that claimed their parents, the nights spent huddled in abandoned buildings, Mary's tears when hunger gnawed too fiercely, against the warmth and belonging the ranch offered. The honest work that filled his days, the way Miguel nodded with approval when he gentled a difficult horse, the sound of Mary's laughter floating from Mrs. Brown's kitchen. "I need to talk to Mary," he finally said, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. Robert nodded, a gentle smile crossing his face. Of course. That evening, John found his sister in their small house, carefully arranging wildflowers in a jar Mrs. Brown had given her. Her face, once gaunt with hunger, had filled out over the weeks at the ranch. The fear that had haunted her eyes for so long had been replaced by contentment. "Mary," he began, sitting beside her on the quilt-covered bed, "Mr. Johnson wants to adopt us, make us legally his family." Her blue eyes widened. "Like a real papa?" "Yes," John replied, carefully explaining everything, how Robert had tested them, how there had never been a Carter gang pursuing them, how the rancher had been searching for someone to inherit not just his land, but his legacy. Mary listened intently, her small hands folded in her lap. When John finished, she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. "As long as we're together, I want to stay," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Then she pulled back, her expression suddenly serious. "And I want to call him Papa." John felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. For the first time since their parents died, he felt the burden of responsibility lighten, shared now with someone worthy of their trust. The next morning, with dew still clinging to the grass, the siblings walked together to the main house where Robert waited on the porch. The rancher's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed his hope. John stepped forward, Mary's hand firmly in his. "Yes," he said simply, "we'd like to stay. We'd like to be your family." Months passed like turning pages in a storybook, each day bringing John and Mary Smith Johnson closer to believing their good fortune was real. The first snow of December blanketed the valley in pristine white, transforming the Johnson Ranch into a winter wonderland that neither child had ever experienced with such security and joy. John Smith Johnson stood beside Robert on the same grassy rise where their lives had changed forever. The boy clutched the adoption papers in his gloved hands, the official document with its formal language, an impressive seal making their new family real in ways even the shared meals and daily work hadn't fully cemented. "Still can't believe it's real," John whispered, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Smith Johnson has a good sound to it." Robert placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "Papers just make official what we already knew," the rancher said, his usually stern face softened by something that looked remarkably like contentment. "You two belong here." The crunch of footsteps in snow announced Mary's arrival as she raced up the hill, her cheeks flushed crimson from the cold. Her woolen coat, new this winter, flapped behind her like wings. "John! Papa!" she called out, the word Papa still new but growing more natural each time she used it. "Mrs. Brown says the Christmas cookies are ready for decorating. She made the frosting with real sugar and everything." The 9-year-old slipped her mittened hand into her brother's, her eyes bright with excitement rather than the fear that had haunted them for so long. The threadbare doll that had once been her only comfort now sat in a place of honor on her bed, no longer needed for constant reassurance. "Are you happy, John?" she asked, looking up at him with earnest curiosity. John glanced from his sister to Robert, then out across the sprawling ranch with its sturdy buildings, smoke curling from chimneys, and the distant figures of Miguel and the other hands tending to winter chores. In the kitchen, Mrs. Brown would be waiting with warm cookies and stories. Old Pete would likely be by the fire, ready with another tall tale about his younger days. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," he answered honestly. The words felt insufficient for the gratitude that swelled in his chest. Robert Johnson nodded, as if approving the sentiment. Together the three turned and walked back toward the main house, toward warmth, toward Christmas preparations, toward the life they'd built through sacrifice, courage, and the unexpected gift of finding family where they least expected it.